Unless you've been living under a rock lately, you may have heard about the interview or history lesson that shook the world, when American journalist Tucker Carlson interviewed the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin. And you may have also seen the global reaction to said interview. A boring waste, simply nonsense, rambling for 2 hours straight by a dictator. Well, this is what the mainstream media giants thought about it, but was it really? Despite the critics, more than 200 million people have watched the interview from around the world. The discrepancy between the mainstream media talking points and public opinion is striking. With the war between Russia and Ukraine now entering its third year, thousands of people and troops have lost their lives, and many more are missing and displaced. The interview gives a fascinating insight into the mind of one of the most powerful people on Earth and the person much of the global community holds responsible for the war. So, what was he really trying to communicate in his long history lesson? What did he mean when he called Ukraine an artificial state? Is there substance to his claims about NATO being a security threat to Russia? And is the United States itself perpetuating the Ukraine war? Let's find out. So Putin started off the interview with a winding history lesson that went back more than 1,000 years. Putin told the story of the relationship between Russia and Ukraine. Now, say what you will about the man, but it can't be denied that Putin knows a lot about history. He mentioned that the roots of Ukrainian history are deeply entwined with those of Russia, beginning with the establishment of the Russian state in the 9th century. He traced the genesis of Russian statehood to Kiev, the capital of the medieval state of Kievan Rus, which is considered to be the predecessor of modern-day Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. In an effort to prove that Ukraine and Russia are indeed two sides of the same coin, Putin gave many examples, such as the baptism of Russia in 1988 by Prince Vladimir of Kiev, which laid the groundwork for a shared Orthodox Christian identity between the two nations. Putin contended that throughout history, Ukraine and Russia have been unified by a common language, culture, and historical trajectory. He even highlighted the challenges faced during the Mongol and Tatar rule in the 13th century, which was cruel to say the least, suggesting that both nations experienced parallel struggles and shared collective destiny. But then, Putin drew attention to external influences, such as those from Poland and Hungary, which he claims have contributed to the formation of a distinct Ukrainian identity separate from Russia. He mentioned, for decades, the Poles have been engaged in the Polonization of this part of the population. They introduced their language there, they began to introduce the idea that these are not entirely Russians, that since they live on the edge, they are Ukrainians. Initially, the word Ukrainian meant that a person lives on the outskirts of the state, at the edge, or is engaged in border service. In fact, it did not mean any particular ethnic group. So the Poles did everything they could to Polish up, and in principle, treated this part of the Russian lands quite harshly, if not cruelly. After taking his history lesson a few hundred years forward, he addressed the aftermath of the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991 and its ramifications for Ukraine. He argued that the dissolution of the USSR resulted in the formation of an artificial Ukrainian state, shaped by decisions made by Soviet leaders. Putin asserted that Ukraine's borders were arbitrarily delineated, encompassing territories historically linked to Russia. To Putin, the Soviet Union's demise disrupted centuries-old bonds between Russia and Ukraine, ushering in a period of geopolitical uncertainty and instability. But to the objective thinker, it would seem that Putin's simplified version of history fits his narrative and the Russian attempts to dominate the region. Labeling Ukraine as an artificial state is a myopic view of statehood itself. The assertion that Ukraine is an artificial state was based on three main points of Putin's interview. Number one, the Russians and Ukrainians come from the same roots. Number two, any differences between them were influenced by external powers. And number three, the Bolshevik leadership arbitrarily set the borders of Ukraine, giving it territories that belonged to Russia. Putin asserted that Ukraine's current borders and identity were shaped by decisions made during the Soviet era, particularly by the Bolshevik leadership. In his version of history, the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 led to the creation of an independent Ukraine without proper consideration for historical, cultural, and ethnic factors. Therefore, an artificial state of Ukraine was formed that continues to cause regional instability. But here we find a major contradiction. On one hand, Putin suggests that Lenin and Stalin granted Ukraine autonomy without justification, implying that Ukraine lacked a distinct identity and was artificially created. However, he also acknowledges the Soviet policy of indigenization, which aimed to promote the development of national cultures and identities within the Soviet Union. The contradiction lies in the fact that if Ukraine truly lacked a distinct identity and was merely an artificial state, as Putin claims, then it would seem counterintuitive for the Soviet leadership to grant it autonomy and support for the development of its national identity through policies like indigenization. The very act of granting Ukraine autonomy and allowing it to have the right to secede from the USSR suggests a recognition of its distinctiveness and historical heritage. Putin's choice of facts make it clear that what he told was a part of Russian propaganda to justify its war in Ukraine. But we must remember that history is often used as a tool for manipulation, and that's the case for every state on the planet. Fortunately, a part of it that remains objective can be used by people like us to figure out an estimate of truth. And we see that by the standards that Putin takes to label Ukraine an artificial state, nearly all modern states would be artificial, based on where you begin your history. When most modern states are part of one another or each other or another empire at some point in their history. By that standard, they should all still be together or be labeled artificial. So we can say that Putin's history lesson was a mere attempt to justify his agenda for war, but this is not the actual cause he quotes for the war. After going through history, Putin moved on to state why Russia has invaded Ukraine, and the reason is actually far more logical than the artificial state debate. And the reason is NATO's expansion. NATO, which was formed in 1949 as a security alliance to contain Soviet expansion, should really have been dissolved after the disintegration of the USSR. But instead, after the Cold War, NATO was reconceived as a cooperative security organization whose mandate was to include two main objectives. Number one, to foster dialogue and cooperation with former adversaries in the Warsaw Pact, and number two, to manage conflicts in areas on the European periphery, such as the Balkans. When the Cold War ended in November 1990, the Warsaw Pact and NATO leaders sought reconciliation and were no longer at loggerheads. The Warsaw Pact disbanded in 1991, but NATO didn't. And here we have another contradiction. A simple question would be that if they did not consider each other enemies anymore, then why does NATO continue to expand? More importantly, if NATO's renewed purpose was to foster dialogue and cooperation with former adversaries, as it claimed, then why did they decline Putin's wish to join NATO in the year 2000, which Putin mentioned in the interview? This wish was not limited to a private conversation with Bill Clinton, but at the time, Putin was actually vocal about the possibility of Russia joining NATO. For example, in a Washington Post article from March 2000, Putin's response to joining NATO was actually quite amicable, saying, "Why not?" This raises questions about NATO's true objectives and its commitment to fostering dialogue and cooperation with former adversaries, which it claims as its mission. So this time, the contradiction is in the actions of NATO, which provide a credible threat to Russia. It really is a chicken and the egg phenomena at this point. Who did what first and who didn't? Did NATO promise to non-enlarge after the Cold War ended? Not in a written treaty, but did NATO send positive gestures to Putin for joining the alliance? Not really. Now, you may be thinking this is because Russia can't be trusted. You see it in ex-Crimea in 2014, but realpolitik is a little more complicated. Even the idea of expanding eastwards fuels Russian cynicism and mistrust. Since the 1990s, NATO has expanded to 14 states towards the east. Moreover, NATO has already shown a propensity to expand towards Ukraine in the year 2008, which really does raise a security question for Russia. However, Ukraine has not become a part of NATO up until now, and peace still seems to be out of the question, unless the war supporters in the West take steps towards de-escalation. But that is not happening anytime soon either, even if it is inevitable, because the American government is contemplating an aid of more than $60 billion to Ukraine. In fact, USA is not only promoting the war, but it is making it possible for Ukraine to defend itself as long as possible before suing for peace. And this is visible in the USA's latest assistance plan to Ukraine, which has been passed by the Senate and awaits its face in the Congress. According to AP, the bill is broken down into military and non-military aid. And can you guess how much of the $60 billion is actually going for humanitarian aid? Guess this, a mere 0.8%. The total aid can be broken down as, in military support, $14 billion for weapons and munitions, $15 billion for military training and intelligence, about a third of the funds for replenishing the US military itself with the weapons and equipment that are going to Kiev, and for non-military aid, $8 billion for basic government operations, excluding pensions, and $1.6 billion for private sector support, and a meager teeny tiny $480 million for displaced Ukrainians. Doesn't this outlook provide an awry picture? Is the United States really protecting Ukraine by prolonging the war? Is it even protecting its own citizens whose tax dollars are used to fund wars in a different continent? There is a valid threat that NATO's presence in Ukraine might just create more uncertainty in in the region by fueling Russian paranoia. It actually looks pretty much the opposite of peacemaking, dialogue, and security, which happens to be NATO's reconceived purpose. So what do you think? Is Putin really justifying his war, or is he asking for a middle ground and worried about Russian national security? Interestingly, Putin mentioned that Russia is just as bourgeoisie as the West, that it wants to be treated as an equal partner. At least in his interview, Putin mentioned that they are just another market economy and deserve equal treatment. Does it mean that the Western agenda of labeling Russia a communist threat stands dissolved? In international relations, manipulation begins with issue framing. Simply put, it's how you label things or what light you give to a situation. For the most part of the post-World War II world, it sufficed America to call Russia communist for its people to beware and see it as an enemy. But Putin's call for peaceful cooperation and his idea of seamlessly tethering the two hemispheres of the world really puts up a propaganda challenge for the Western powers. And it might just take more than calling it boring or typical to stop the shifting public opinion. And this brings us back to where we started. The manipulation of facts, whether of past or present, is used as propaganda everywhere. Aren't the United States' relentless efforts to make Russia appear a monster state the propaganda equivalent of Russian efforts to label Ukraine as an artificial state? Both are made up of generalizations to support each country's political and military ventures. However, to break free from such cynical cycles of propaganda, free speech and media are necessary. This is why the interview of Putin with Tucker Carlson has shown a ray of hope. Maybe his popularity is a sign that most of the world thinks peace is long overdue, but it can only end the war in Ukraine if the American people demand it. In conclusion, the Russian-Ukraine war is becoming a bigger and more complicated issue by the minute. Countries are pouring in more aid, military power, diplomatic influence, and all the propaganda tools to win the war. A war that seems to have gone far beyond just between the two countries. In fact, maybe Putin would view that it has always been more than just between Russia and Ukraine. It is clear that Putin views NATO as an existential threat, especially in a country that shares a 2,300-kilometer long border with Russia. While Putin's idea of claiming Ukrainian land may be far-fetched, his sense of insecurity due to NATO is more justifiable. But does this justify invading another country? So overall, what do you think of Putin's views and his approach to the war? Do you think that Putin is a person that can't be reasoned with? Or should other countries try and start the peace process? Let us know in the comments. Hope this was insightful. Until next time.